All right, class, welcome to the second part of our lecture for the week. I have 3 videos for you for the week to cover the remaining part of the lecture. And so the first video is going to cover the first objective, in which we're going to define key terms associated with the relationship between theory and research. The second video is going to look at covering theory and how research and theory are connected to each other. And then the last video is looking at how we differentiate and what we mean by theory-based research and theory that is based on research. So these two terms can be rather confusing when you just read them at their face value, but hopefully by the end of watching the videos for the rest of the week, this last objective makes more sense to you. All right, so let's go over the first objective. So let's do a little bit of review. So when we have this top-down approach, when we start with the theory and we're testing hypotheses by collecting data and looking at observations and confirming and testing those hypotheses, what line of thinking and model of inquiry are we using, deductive or inductive? Whereas we have the bottom-up approach where we start with data collection and observation, analyze that data and look for patterns to see whether or not we can come up and make sense of the things around us and thus create and generate hypotheses and generating and creating theories, which is which line of thinking? So when starting with the theory and testing theories, this is the deductive line of thinking. Whereas when we have the bottom up and we start with observation and generate hypotheses, this is the inductive line of thinking. And so when we have the deductive line of thinking, are we using mostly qualitative or quantitative approaches? And same question when we have the inductive line of thinking. Are we using mostly qualitative or quantitative approaches? Well, when we have the deductive line of thinking, we're pretty much using mostly quantitative methodologies, where data ends up being numerical. Whereas in inductive line of thinking, where we start with observations and create and generate hypotheses, we tend to use more qualitative approaches like interviews, for example. And so let's talk about theory. A theory, in terms of a couple definitions, are a belief system based on observation and supposition. And so, again, we think about it's a belief system, something that we try to understand and believe in based on what we see around the world in terms of the observations and data we collect, and supposition. What do we suppose that data, what do we suppose the relationships might be existing in what we are observing and trying to understand? Glanz et al., which is found, if you recall, the Purple Big Theory textbook, defines theory as a set of interrelated concepts, definitions, and propositions that present a systematic view of events or situations by specifying relations among variables in order to explain and predict events or situations. Does this definition of theory sound similar to another definition we've covered in the past couple of weeks? It looks and sounds very similar to how we describe research, and particularly health science research or public health research. But when we're thinking about theory, this is really more of concepts, definitions, propositions that try to make sense of things around us, try to explain or predict phenomenon, right? And specifically specifying what those relationships are between these different concepts and variables that make sense of the world around us. And so in simple terms, for the purposes of health science and public health, theories try to explain why people do what they do and why things happen as they do. But if we recall the miasma theory, what do you remember about the miasma theory and what it actually means? Going back to the cholera. And who is the famous epidemiologist? John Snow. And so before John Snow conducted his observational research, a lot of people, scientists, medical professionals, and lay people in public, thought that disease was spread through bad air. Hence the miasma theory, right? Miasmata, decaying organic matter. When that turned rancid and decayed and smelled bad, people thought that that nasty smell, noxious smell, that bad air is what caused disease and illness. But as we know, that miasma theory was found to be not true, And we found that the germ theory was the one that really made sense to how disease was spread, particularly how cholera was spread. Right? We know through infected waters and food that people can get sick, and then this bacterium, Vibrio cholerae, was what actually caused and is spread, or what spreads and what causes cholera. Right? So again, thinking about different theories can be generated in terms of what we think is happening, but we're always trying to test those theories through the deductive line of thinking to see whether or not those theories tend to hold up to be true or not. We can always revise those theories, we can completely expunge those theories, or we can confirm those theories. And so when we think about different types of theories, we have two that we're going to cover, or two that we kind of try to understand. First one is explanatory, where we're trying to describe why a problem exists. Why is there cancer? Why is it that higher levels of men who have sex with men have higher cases of HIV? Why is it that certain things happen the way that they do? And thus what we're looking for are factors that contribute to the problem that hopefully can be changed. What are some of these independent variables? What are some of these risk factors or some of these protective factors that it might either contribute to the problem or might help alleviate the problem? So, for example, some of the things that we can measure or try to understand in terms of factors that might lead to a particular problem might be like lack of knowledge. Maybe people don't know how to use a condom correctly, and thus we see a spread of HIV or other STDs. Maybe people don't know about PrEP. Maybe people don't know about undetectable means untransmittable. Maybe people don't know how to do certain things, and thus we can measure this and see whether or not these factors, these independent variables that might help explain a problem are things that we can actually change. We have certain theories that help explain or help us understand and provide a framework for these explanatory problems, like the health belief model and the theory of planned behavior. But then we have these causal types of theories, and many of these theories help us guide in developing different types of interventions. If we know that X indeed causes Y, then what can we do to intervene? In our causal theories, in our explanatory theories, we're trying to understand why problems exist. We don't know why what's happening. We don't know what causes it yet. So that's when we're doing explanatory theories or using explanatory theories, we can't really develop or plan programs that are trying to make a difference. This is where we use causal theories because they really help us and articulate concepts that we can translate it into different messages and strategies to actually make change. So we have one of the examples, the trans-theoretical model, also known as TTM. And one of the elements and one of the constructs within TTM is stages of change. Pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, ultimately termination, but we know that within that action, we have relapse. Right? And so thinking about what can we do to intervene in some type of behavior change or some phenomenon that we experience in the world. And so let's take a look at an example. This is a theoretical model. We're looking at this from time, from left to right, and so we see that somebody's self-efficacy, right? The confidence that we have in ourselves to actually do something when we say we're going to do it. We have the confidence in ourselves to actually do it correctly. So we think about our self-efficacy and how that might lead to sexual behaviors, whether or not we tend to use or practice safe sex, use contraception, whatever it is that comes to our sexual behaviors. So we know that our confidence within ourselves to do a particular behavior and what we actually do in terms of our sexual activities, we know that these things can ultimately reduce the number of new HIV infections or even STI infections in light of the recent historical numbers when it comes to STI cases. And so we see we're using some particular symbols here. We have circles, we have boxes, we have arrows. What do the arrows signify? The arrows signify that there is some causal relationship. But if we have some causal relationship, what does that mean in terms of the type of data, the type of study that we're conducting? Is it a one-time study? We collect data one time, or are we collecting data multiple times? in such a case as a longitudinal study, for example. When we have arrows, and these arrows are signifying some cause and effect relationship, and in order for us to use these arrows and to establish and be able to say that X does indeed cause Y, we need to have multiple time points, which means we have to collect data at multiple times, not just at one time. Thus, we're many times doing a longitudinal study, or a study that is at least looking at pre and post, before and after. Right? Thus, we have time. But when you do homework 1, pay attention to your theoretical model. Pay attention to the symbols and what that actually means. So let's make some sense of the terminology. We have this term concept. It's a specific thing that we think influences the phenomenon of interest. So far, you guys pitched to me this past week what your DV and what your IV is. Again, the DV is your phenomenon of interest, the problem, the issue at hand. And so you have one concept that you've already thought about, your outcome, your DV. But you also have kind of come up with your IV, what you think might influence that phenomenon, that outcome, that health behavior. And thus, concepts are building blocks. They're the primary elements of a theory. But it's the very first part of a theory. These concepts are intangible. They're abstract. You cannot directly measure it as you described it as such. As you guys have said, you're looking at stress, sleep, alcohol use, parental modeling, motivation, substance use. All of these things are intangible. They're abstract. You cannot directly measure it as you've described it. So we have these things like health beliefs, and how our health beliefs can lead to certain health behaviors. They're so nebulous, hence we use this cloud symbol. The cloud represents this nebulous concept, intangible, abstract. But when we start using a theory and start making sense of these concepts, because we are tying that into a theory, those concepts are now considered constructs, also known as factors. And so that cloud then turns into a circle or to an oval, because this is now defining a construct that is a little bit more tangible because we are using it in a theory. However, it is still intangible. It is still abstract. We still cannot measure it directly. So for example, we have health beliefs, a concept. But when we tie that health belief into self-efficacy, like we use in health belief model, or in social cognitive theory, or trans-theoretical model, we know that we can make it a little bit more tangible because we kind of know what we mean by this concept of health beliefs by tying in to the theory and now defining self-efficacy as the construct. We have this nebulous concept of health behavior. Well, we can tie that into a theory, like health belief model, and say, okay, the construct that we're actually looking at is safer sex. How our beliefs affects our behavior, how our self-efficacy affects our safer sex behaviors, we're making it a little bit more tangible, but still, self-efficacy, safer sex are still constructs, are still factors that are still intangible, still abstract, and still cannot directly measure it. Until we get to a variable. A variable is a factor or construct that we have operationalized. And because we have operationalized it, we can now directly measure it. For example, how depressed are you? From 0 to 10. From 0 is not depressed, to 10 is I'm extremely depressed. We have turned depression, which at first could be just completely nebulous, abstract concept, construct, but when I ask it in a particular way, I can then directly measure that variable. And so, in our models that we're going to take a look at, we see that variables are symbolized as squares or rectangles. So using our examples here, we started off with the nebulous concept of health beliefs and health behaviors, and how that health belief turned out to be a self-efficacy, and the health behavior was now safer sex. These constructs we still could not measure. But we can now measure self-efficacy by using the SUSES, the Condom Use Self-Efficacy Scale. And we can actually directly measure safer sex by asking a condom use question. How many times have you used a condom in the last 6 months? Those two constructs were turned into and operationalized to be variables, and thus we can directly measure self-efficacy by asking questions on the SUSES, and we can directly measure the construct of safer sex by using the variable, how many times have you used a condom in the last 6 months? So let's revisit our model. So we have our constructs of self-efficacy and sexual behavior. I want to say real quick, do not be confused by this box here of the long-term health outcome, which is to reduce the number of new infections. This is not what we mean by the variable and the symbol of the square or the rectangle. This is simply showing us a long-term health outcome that comes at the end of our model in terms of our time. When we look at measuring and turning in those constructs into a variable, this is what I mean. Self-efficacy, the construct as a circle, can be directly measured and operationalized to answer and ask three particular questions. The SUSES mechanics 1, 2, and 3. Three particular questions on whether or not somebody knows how to use a condom. We can measure sexual behavior by the variable, how often did you use a condom in the last 6 months? Notice these squares are the variables because these are the ones that directly measure the constructs. So making sense of the terminology. A concept, again, completely nebulous, intangible, abstract, just an idea. But once we connect that to a theory, that concept now becomes a construct, more tangible, but still not directly measurable. Until we operationalize that construct into something measurable, like variables, then we have something we can actually ask people a question about and extract data from them so we can actually examine that and test these types of research, or test these types of theories, these types of hypotheses in the research that we do. Hence, we are working with theory-based research. It is research that we're conducting that is based on a theory, theory-based research. All right, so that's the first part of the lecture. Go ahead and continue on to the second video.